Angela, thank you so much for doing this interview. There's a lot of nostalgia swirling around about 1968. What is your most nostalgic moment? What was the high point for you of that year?
Well, I like to think that I'm not so much influenced by nostalgia, but I think historical memory is important.
But everyone has a bit of nostalgia, yes. Even you, surely.
Well, that's probably true. 1968 was probably the year in which more happened in my political life than any other year I have lived, and I've lived many, many years, of course. You know, I'm thinking about the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was involved in an organization called SNCC. At that particular time, I had been involved in the Black Panther Party that same year. And later that same year, I joined the Communist Party, so that there were major shifts in my own political life. But of course, everyone associates the student uprisings in Paris, and of course the largest general strike probably in the history of capitalism that happened in May 1968. But there were also uprisings happening in black communities throughout the country in response to the assassination of Dr. King. 1968 is an important year for me because it's the year during which, or the time during which, an emergent feminist consciousness, not so much gender separate from other issues, but an emerging consciousness of the interconnectedness of racism and capitalism and sexism, of course.
And do you think 50 years later, uncannily, we might be living through another such moment? Me Too, Black Lives Matter, you know,
of course,
left-wing and right-wing politics, you know, one could argue at the extremes competing with each other.
Well, of course it's interesting. History never replicates itself, but I think that what we are witnessing today are some of the fruits of the struggles that are associated with 1968. You know, certainly the emergence of a worldwide feminist movement, the women's resistance to the election of Donald Trump and all that that has meant in creating a kind of global solidarity against the Trump administration and the militarism and the racism that it entails.
Is it the fruits of what you were trying to do in 1968, or is it an indication that what you were trying to do hadn't come to fruition, hadn't actually reached a conclusion, was unfinished business?
Well, I think we've learned a great deal since 1968. In 1968, many of us who were involved in radical movements really believed that the revolution was around the corner. And of course, there were major shifts happening all over the world. The African liberation movement, the Cuban Revolution, the Vietnam War. We were convinced that the world was going to change, and we were going to be a part of an anti-capitalist, racist revolution. Our awareness of gender was not as complex as it could have been, as it should have been, as it is now. So I think today we are witnessing a certain continuity between the consciousness of the 1960s, 1968. But this is a period in which certainly women are on the rise, and that's very exciting because women were pretty much in the background in 1968, with the exception of a few individuals and a few movements.
I've spoken to quite a few members of Black Lives Matter and also the Me Too movement who said actually really very little has changed since 1968. You know, the clock stopped, you know, moving forwards for us. That's why we have to go through this struggle again. Do you think they're right, or is that too negative of you?
Well, in a sense, very little has changed. It's interesting, I was reflecting on the fact that when I learned about the assassination of Martin Luther King, I was in the process of printing a poster about a young black man who had been killed by the police in Los Angeles.
The Trayvon Martin of 1968.
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. So in that sense, little has changed.
Has it got worse, perhaps?
I don't know whether it's gotten worse. I think our consciousness has grown, and there's been more media and social media attention to what has been going on since the era of the immediate aftermath of slavery. But what I think has changed is the understandings, the consciousness, and I think that feminism has a lot to do with this. And when I say feminism, I'm not speaking of mainstream feminism. I'm not speaking of the feminism that was represented, that has been represented by figures like Hillary Clinton. I'm talking about a feminism from below, a feminism that has been generated by women of color, black women, Latina women, Muslim women, Native American women, one that emphasizes the interconnections of all social justice struggles and the fact that one cannot consider gender aside from race and class.
So you have this interconnectivity, and then at the same time you have a president of the United States, democratically elected, who is openly misogynist. Some would accuse him of being racist as well, although these of course are all charges that he denies. But that tells you something, doesn't it? That on one hand you have this consciousness that's moved in one direction, on the other hand you have half of society saying we reject that.
Well, it's not half, and I don't think Trump was democratically elected. The majority of people who...
Well, he won the Electoral College, I mean, by the rules.
Yes, but when one considers that the Electoral College is an institution rooted in slavery that was designed during the era of slavery to guarantee to slaveholders and to states with a small white population and a large slave population the kind of federal leverage they wanted. So.
But even allowing for that, I mean, and the Electoral College is a strange anomaly, and you know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by a whopping 3 million. Even allowing for that, the fact that Trump is president of the United States of America with the views that he holds, that he's proud of in public, is astonishing, is it not?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. We all continue to be incredulous that someone like Donald Trump can occupy the highest office of,
but what does that tell you about
land.
American society, that this has happened?
Well, I do not believe that he represents, his administration, his ideology, his strategies represent the will of the majority of the people. We have to consider that relatively few people actually go to the polls, not even half of all of the people in the US. And so many people did not vote because they didn't see a significant choice between the two candidates. So the election of Trump is the product of a crisis in the electoral system and in a sense of a defunct two-party system. Had there been another party that was not tied to the capitalist corporations, that does not have you know, all of the baggage that the Democratic Party has, then perhaps the results of the election would have been different. I think it's important to think broadly and not to assume that because Trump is in office now, that represents the democratic will of the people of the United States.
And yet in the 2016 elections, interesting things were happening. I mean, interesting things are happening all over politics in the Western world. One of them is that a lot of the people who became politically aware in 1968, like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, self-avowed, you know, former Stalinist in this country, who captured 23% of the presidential vote. The fact that these, some would call them political fossils from the 1960s, are back and actually either running countries or almost running countries, that is also quite an astonishing fact, isn't it?
Well, of course, I think it's understandable that people who were politicized during that era have led a life of political commitment and involvement.
But they were in the shadows for decades, and suddenly they've sprung to the
well,
center stage.
Not necessarily. I think that simply because one does not have a public presence illuminated by the media does not mean that one isn't doing work. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that the emergence of new movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too, Time's Up movement, those movements were not spontaneous developments. They reflect the very serious organizing that has been done over decades. And I think it's a lesson to people who sometimes become depressed because they feel that they're not seeing the immediate results of the work that they do. It's a lesson that sometimes it takes decades for these struggles to reach fruition. I actually am impressed with the work of younger people. And I would like to see more younger people in electoral politics, as we are seeing younger people in the kind of on-the-ground, grassroots politics.
So if that's the case, how come the imagination of today's youth, on the kind of protest side, has been captured by people who should be in political retirement? Bernie Sanders has never been closer to the presidency than he was in 2016. Jeremy Corbyn could well be the next Prime Minister of Great Britain.
Yes, which would be great.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon here in France,
well,
who started his campaign as a joke and became a viable candidate of the left.
Well, I think that generationality is an important dimension of political life.
What does that mean?
It means that struggles do not emerge spontaneously, that they have a connection to what came before. And it's important that younger people recognize that connection with the historical radicalism. But at the same time, I think it's important for younger people to take the lead. It's very interesting, isn't it, that we were talking about the election of Trump, that a mere 4 years before and 8 years before, it was Barack Obama who was elected. And with all of the problems that one might point to in the Obama administration, at least he represented hope. He represented a kind of imagination for a better future.
And yet, under Barack Obama, the African-American population suffered economically. Black Lives Matter started under Obama, partly as a reaction to what was happening, with people like Trayvon Martin, police violence against innocent black young men.
And that was the importance of the Obama administration, creating the space and creating the hope and creating, generating the aspirations that could allow for the emergence of these movements. I don't think it's accidental that these movements emerged under Obama. And for me, that was the importance of
because there are many African Americans who take a negative view and say, although he was our first black president, he didn't do enough for us. He didn't really, champion our cause.
That's true. But what could one man ever do? I mean, I'm not defending a president of the United States, but certainly if one compares Obama to the current president, we would. I think there are very few progressive people who would not choose Obama. But I think change comes from below. And I mean, it sounds like I'm praising Obama, which I'm not, but what I did appreciate about him was that he always indicated that he could not make these changes alone. And I think that during his administration, there was a failure of people to generate the kind of mass movements that could have pushed us further, that could have pushed him in a more radical direction.
In many ways, as we discussed before, some of the same movements that were very active in 1968, protest movements, disgruntlement with the state of politics, they're relevant again today. But what has changed between 68 and 2018 is the internet, social media, the fragmentation of information, fake news. How does that change things for you as a protest intellectual?
Well, it's very complicated because on the one hand, the emergence of new technologies of communication has revolutionized the capacity to
mobilize,
create communication, and of course, yes, mobilization, and in a sense, we were yearning for that ability to communicate with people the world over. In the 1960s, when we attempted to generate solidarities against the war in Vietnam, for
you
the
wished you'd had the
liberation-
internet then. Yeah.
Absolutely. We hardly had long-distance calls because they were so expensive. We relied on snail mail to create that solidarity. And I should say that as a person who benefited from global solidarity in the early 1970s, millions of people all over the world came to my aid, and I'm sitting here today as a result of that solidarity.
Remind us why they came to your aid.
Well, I was charged with 3 capital crimes. I was a political prisoner, falsely charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy because of my politics, because of my membership in the Communist Party, because of my involvement in the Black Liberation Movement. And so people all over the world, of course, this was the era during which communist parties existed in virtually every country of the world. There was a massive movement in Paris and in London and all of the European capitals. So I take solidarity very seriously. And if one compares the ways in which solidarity was generated in 1968, in the era of 1968, it seems that that we were able to experience on an emotional level even a connection, connections, affinities with people and struggles in far-flung places. And now that the internet exists, it's possible to make those connections, but I don't know whether the affinities are produced. And
I was going to ask you about that. I think it's fascinating. Maybe although you can go global and viral with a click of a mouse, the affinity isn't there to the same extent.
Well,
because people, suffer protest privately, with their app, with their computer.
I think you're right. There's an individualization that is very much a product of neoliberal ideology and discourse.
But also of the tools. I mean, you can be part of a protest movement from the comfort of your bedroom, never having to go into the street and actually chant a slogan, because it can all be done online.
Well, that's true, but I think one of the major differences is about a relationship between an individual who might imagine herself or himself or their self separately from communities, from movements, from organizations, whereas the solidarities I'm speaking about were generated from community to community.
Right.
And I think that this is one of the major challenges of this era, to combat the individualization effect that is a direct result of global capitalism and the neoliberal ideology of this period.
How much of a problem is fake news for the future of politics, whether it's established politics or protest politics?
I think it emphasizes the phenomenon itself, teaches us a lesson about the importance of critical engagement. And
ask questions.
always
question assumptions.
We should always be asking questions anyway.
Do you question your assumptions?
I try. I try to question my assumptions. I try to question the language I use to express my ideas, because oftentimes the concepts themselves actually militate against what it is I'm trying to do. I'm trained in critical theory, and I'm very grateful that I did have that training to question not only the world, not only the object of perception, not only the object of research, but to question that with which we attempt to understand the world as well.
So you are trained in self-questioning and critical theory, but at the same time you are also an icon. Your Afro hairstyle was the most iconic hairstyle of the 1960s. Even more iconic than Donald Trump's hair is today.
Well, but
you're the only politician, I think, in the world who's had 2 songs written about them, one by the Stones, one by John Lennon.
Oh, there were many more.
I'm sure, but yes. Okay. Well, the 2 most famous ones.
Yeah.
How many were there? How many songs have you had written about you?
Have
you counted them?
No, I'm just learning about some now.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, within jazz, there were quite a few songs.
Anyway, my question really is, how does it feel to be an icon?
I don't feel myself to be an icon. So that the question itself, I have to question the question. I know that there is an image, a representation, that I understand is not so much about me personally, but it captures a movement. It captures a possibility. Of course, I could never live up to all of the assumptions about what it means to be an icon. So I've come to terms with that by recognizing that it's not so much about me as an individual. It's about the collective power that was harnessed in the campaign around my freedom, so that I can actually appreciate it.
But you're intellectualizing it. I wonder if you personally, when you got that sort of attention then, and to some extent still now, does it make you feel, do you feel flattered by it? Do you feel embarrassed by it? Do you ignore it? I'm just trying to imagine what that would be like.
I used to feel embarrassed by it because I experienced the vast difference between who I felt myself to be and what was projected onto the image, the representation, the icon. And I came to terms with it by recognizing precisely that it was actually a production of a people in struggle. And so I don't identify so much with the images, but I don't identify with them in the sense that they are of me as the person that I am, but they are the creation of people who struggle with and for me.
What's your biggest regret?
I don't have very many regrets. I have, there was a time when I thought that being in jail was the worst experience of my life, facing capital punishment. But then, I've come to realize that in a lot of ways it was a gift to have that experience. It allowed me to grapple with the whole prison issue, and my life has really revolved around analyses and struggles around and against the prison industrial complex. And as I always say, I learned how to practice yoga in prison. I became a vegetarian in prison. So that many things that were the hardest moments of my life, I now see as gifts and as actually the foundations of some of the most important aspects of my life history.
Do you wish you'd run for elected office?
Well, I actually did. I was the vice presidential candidate for the Communist Party.
Okay.
But I think electoral politics is important, but I think I can be most helpful in the broader arena of politics. I think it's so important to think about the relationship between what happens in movements and how movements have an impact on electoral politics. So I want to be there where the real work is done.
Finally and briefly, will America survive the experience of Donald Trump?
I think we will. I think we will. And I'm hoping, as I've said on many occasions, that when it's all said and done, this period, this 4 years, hopefully it won't be 4 years, will be...
He's just been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by his own party,
yeah,
who hates him.
Well, will be a kind of a footnote, because, of course, the Trump administration is literally attempting to turn the clock back, make America great again, as if America has ever been great. So I think that the election of Trump was a reaction to a movement of history that is headed in a direction that is designed to allow us to come to terms, understand the impact of colonization, of slavery, these moments in history that have been completely rendered invisible. And now, of course, in Europe and in the US, all over the global north, we're seeing the reverberations of the impact of slavery and colonization. And I'm convinced that we will move forward.
How should America deal with the extraordinary problem of incarceration, especially amongst the African American population?
Well, of course, some of us have been addressing this issue for decades, since there were perhaps 200,000 people behind bars. Today, the U.S. has the largest incarcerated population in the world. 25% of the planet's population in prisons. Women in prison in the U.S. constitute almost one third of all women in the world who are behind bars. So there's clearly a problem. Finally, there's been some recognition within the U.S., even among the right wing, who've created this formation called the Right on Crime. But I think the problem is that the assumption remains that prisons can be reformed. If one looks at the history of the prison system, there is a pendulum that swings from reform to incapacitation, from back to reform. So we're in a period now where people are demanding reform. The problem is that reforms have often rendered the institution itself more permanent and ultimately more repressive, more racist. So those of us who've been engaging with this question for a long time, many of us have come to the conclusion that the system itself needs to be abolished. So we call ourselves, instead of reformists, we call ourselves abolitionists.
So how do you deal with criminals?
Well, you see, the problem is that prisons cannot even deal with crimes. The vast majority of people who are in prison, the more than 2 million people behind bars in the U.S., are not criminals per se. They may have committed property offenses. They may be in prison because they've never had the opportunity to get an education, because of illiteracy, because of poverty, because of lack of housing, because of mental health issues. The 3 largest mental health facilities in the U.S. are county jails in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So the question of what to do with people who really commit horrendous acts of violence is, first of all, a relatively small one, but second of all, not even taken seriously by the fact that they're simply shipped off to prison, and we never have an opportunity to ask, how do we get rid of these horrible acts of violence? How do we purge our societies of violence against women, gender violence, violence against trans people? You know, how do we address the fact that people who live in violent relationships as children can ultimately replicate that violence? So we need a different kind of justice. We need a form of justice that's not retributive, that does not meet violence with violence, but that seriously asks questions about how to make relationships among human beings more productive.
Is there any place on planet Earth, on planet reality, that is invented, that has come up with the system you describe?
Well, one can see promises in indigenous communities and restorative justice practices, transformative justice practices. One can see the promise of a different idea of justice. But if you're asking about a developed justice system in the global north, I would say no, we cannot see this. And this is precisely the reason why we need to allow our imagination to lead us in a direction that may mean that we want something that has never actually existed in the world before.
I like that. Good note to end on.